This opening passage, which I think is going to give background into the ages of the world or the Weltelters, from the Theosopher of the 17th century, Jacob Boehme, and it was published in 1623. And the text is the Mysterium Magnum. This passage is called Of the Two Principles, God's Love and Anger, of Darkness and Light. In this flagrant or enkindling of the fire, two kingdoms sever themselves, and yet are only one. But they divide to one another. The one comprehends not the other in its own source, and yet they proceed from one original, and are dependent on one another. And the one without the other were a nothing, and yet both receive their source from one original. This is a fundamental passage because what Boehme is talking about are these two primal forces, a light fire and a dark fire. And we're not meant to think of this in binary logic. We're meant to think of one as the ground of the other. And they're linked together by what's called identity, or the identity of what's called the Godhead or spirit. And so the same logic plays into the text that we're going to talk about today, the ages of the world, where the what is and being, the real and the ideal, being and what is, are grounded by something called the indifference point. So it's pure identity, but when being is set forth in movement, the what is at rest. And so there's always there's always a movement and rest, always kind of flipping back and forth, a higher and a lower, in a kind of rotary circling motion. So I thought that would give some reference to some of the text, especially some of the kind of poetic language, the darkness, the light, the yes and the no that's played out through the text.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is opposed to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce today's guest, we just want to mention we do have a Patreon at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. But if not, maybe leave us a nice review on iTunes. But Taylor and I are very excited to bring you all Christopher Satoor to discuss some Schelling. So Christopher, thanks so much for taking the time to join us and introduce us to the work of F.W.J. Schelling. Or did I get that right? I hope I did.
I think that's it.
You did, yeah.
So what is it? Friedrich Wilhelm, what's the J? Johann?
Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph.
Joseph. I was making a guess. Yeah, there's a lot of Friedrich Wilhelms, aren't there? Right? There's
Yes.
There's Nietzsche. There's what I know that Hegel has it in his name too, right? It's
There's Novalis, Friedrich von Hardenberg. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, that's I guess naming your sons after a king or whatever is a good way to go. In any case, Christopher, we're glad to have you here today. We've talked a lot about all things German idealism, if you will, but we did want to hear about your background and your interest in this period of philosophy that still continues to fascinate and to sort of inspire new ways of thinking. And just maybe tell us a little bit about your intellectual journey.
Thanks for having me here. I'm quite honored actually to be discussing Schelling and with you and these great texts. So thank you for having me on. My journey is I call it the great 360. So I pretty much started at a community college. I wasn't sure of what I wanted to do. There was a retired Kant scholar, actually, believe it or not, working at this college. And he was reading the essay, What is Enlightenment by Kant. And in this essay, Kant says, sapere aude, so dare to know, have the courage
Yes.
to use your own understanding. And this blew me away because I took it as okay, what do you mean by dare to know? What does that even mean, to have the courage to use your own understanding? And then I began studying with him, and we read Kant, Hegel, and by the time I got to university, I was reading Kant, Fichte, and Hegel, and I was really, really immersed in German idealism. But then I kind of branched out. I kind of left German idealism a bit. I started reading Nietzsche and Heidegger, and then slowly moved away from Heidegger because of some complications with Heidegger's thought,
Yeah. Hmm.
just a little bit.
Hmm.
And then I found Deleuze, and it's so funny. The first time I took a Deleuze class was a fourth year course on his cinema books. And the
Oh,
professor,
fascinating. That's a
Awesome.
fascinating intro.
Yeah, for sure.
yeah, and the professor decided that this was the best text to understand Deleuze's, kind of philosophy of time
Yeah.
through the cinema books. And when I first read Deleuze, I had to leave to go throw up because it challenged everything. I'm not even joking. Because at the time I was so encased in phenomenology, and like the first 10 pages of the cinema book, it's Deleuze just ripping apart phenomenology, talking about how it's just like drawing a line and like abstracting on this line. From there, I became kind of obsessed with Deleuze, and especially difference, repetition, and the logic of sense. I wrote my master's on Deleuze with a Hegelian Deleuzian named Jim Vernon, but I also had sent my master's MRP to both Peter Hallward, who I was writing against, and Constantine V. Bundas, who's
Yeah.
also in Canada. Yeah. So Constantine read it and enjoyed it very much. So did Peter, even though I was attacking Peter's position. And essentially, do you want me to tell you just a little bit about it?
Oh, of course. I mean,
Yeah.
because just to preface, Peter Hallward, he's maybe even more than Badiou has written most virulently against Deleuze's philosophy. So it's kind of nice to know that even though you were countering his position, he appreciated your input.
Oh, he sent me like 3 different articles he had written. And I mean, Peter Hallward's position on Deleuze is, I don't want to say sloppy. It's interesting. You can tell he thinks that Deleuze is apolitical, and he thinks he's like,
Yes.
spiritualized, and
It's kind of a straw man in
absolutely.
a way. But go ahead, tell us about your work.
And so I took it on. I took this thesis on. I took Peter Hallward on. I took Badiou on, and I took Zizek on, because I thought all of them didn't have a very good reading of Deleuze, especially Badiou. Badiou, one of the biggest problems with Badiou is that he only reads Deleuze. He doesn't read the Deleuze and Guattari work, which is very problematic. I tend to think that Zizek just is too dismissive of Deleuze.
And Guattari.
So I wrote this piece, and I sent it to some Deleuzians, and I heard back from Ronald Bogue, and he said he really liked it. And then I heard from Ian Buchanan, and they published it in Deleuze Studies. And then when I started my PhD, I started becoming a little disheartened with post-structuralism, not because of the material, but more since the kind of cliqueiness of some of the academics that are involved. And so I realized that I need to find my own niche, and I ended up taking a class with my mentor, Joan Steigerwald, she works on Kant and Fichte and Schelling and Novalis, and she's a kind of romantic scholar. She works on the history of the philosophy of science, romanticism, and German idealism. And then that's it. I read Schelling's Freedom Essay, and that was it. I was just like, this is, because at the same time, the Freedom Essay is a response, oddly enough, to Deleuze's Spinozaism.
Interesting.
And it, in a sense, instead of focusing on expressionism, it kind of breathes life into pluralism, and it has a kind of relational ontology. It talks about this idea of process and personality and individuation before Simondon, right? So such an interesting text, and I just fell in love with it.
I revisited, since you brought him up, his history of the notion of the individual, which is kind of his notes leading up to Simondon's notes leading up to his thesis. As you know, Deleuze draws on heavily, at least the first half of it. And I thought it was interesting the way that he talks about Schelling, the way that he kind of, if you will, summarizes him. So I'll just read the first sentence. He says, for Schelling, the living being consists of a pair of opposites and of a power superior to this pair of opposites, playing the forces of these opposites against one another so as to maintain life by inflecting them and playing them like instruments. I thought that was an interesting way of beginning his summary of what he got out of Schelling.
I didn't even know that he had written on him. So thank you. Now I'm going to have to go take a look at that. But he's right. There is this, France at the time had been so Hegelianized by Kojève and Hippolyte, right?
Yep.
That Hegel's philosophy, and to this day, I still think, even contemporary Hegelians, there's this kind of asphyxiating gaze on Hegel's dialectic. And there's so much to Aufhebung or sublation. And what Schelling has against, and I think what Schelling has against sublation is the same thing that Deleuze has against it. Deleuze calls it the shadow of difference, meaning it doesn't allow this emerging virtuality to breathe. And so Schelling maintains contradictions, and contradictions are not bad things. Contradictions, right? He'll say things like, without contradiction, there is no life.
Yes, he says that exactly. Yeah.
Yes. And so what contradictions are held, they're held in their individuality, yet they're united by, let's say, kind of an immanent identity that's the unconditioned, that it's called, that holds them in place, but allows them the breathing room, allows them to be expressive, to be themselves, to differ from one another.
I like that. And I told Coop to look at this, and I know he did. I liked that the first time Schelling appears in Deleuze's Difference of Repetition, he very vehemently kind of defends Schelling against Hegel's attack. Hegel kind of parodies Schelling. It's this Schelling's difference is the night in which all cows are black or something like this, right?
Right.
And Deleuze is very much saying, like, of the two thinkers, Hegel and Schelling, it's Schelling who actually brings forth difference with a kind of, in a way that actually rescues it or gives it a kind of life, where in Hegel's dialectic, it's this false movement. Obviously, I'm paraphrasing and abstracting from a lot of things, but I thought that was an interesting, because I didn't know until reading that section, Hegel's remark, which has become almost as famous as the Owl of Minerva and all this other, shit that gets picked from Hegel. I didn't know that the context was so clear that he was disparaging his contemporary.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'll get back to that in 1 second, but I just wanted to make another correlation between the two. When Deleuze starts talking about the color red in Difference and Repetition, he says that red is not just red. There are degrees of red that are unfolding within this continuum of redness. I honestly think it's like footnotes to Schelling, because the same thing is happening. So when Hegel makes this attack at Schelling's absolute indifference, or the indifference point that you read in The Ages of the World, what indifference allows for, in the same sense, are degrees of difference to unfold. So the indifference point allows for difference to emerge. It holds the contradictions, but allows individuality and the so-called play of the potencies. So Hegel never got this. He never understood this. He just saw this as a homogenizing absolute. But really, the true homogenizing agent would be, in a sense, Hegel. So Hegel's phenomenon notoriously with this idea of a seed that then grows into a plant, and the seed vanishes as it grows into a plant and then to a fruit. Ironically, Schelling brings up the same example, but each of those stages are unique and are an identity. And they're a part of the flow of that process, right? So rather than synthesize everything in just the fruit, Schelling will say, no, you're missing this. You're missing the idea that the seed is differentiated from the plant is differentiated from the flower and the fruit, and all of them are held together by the process, as opposed to Aufhebung, or sublation in the end of the fruit. So he leaves a teleology. Hegel leads this kind of telos, or purpose, that ends in the synthesis. And what you miss is the process. You miss the organic life, right?
So I was thinking about this too. We may have to cut this out, but I was thinking, Christopher, it's interesting that you mentioned color, because I was thinking about how, more so like Schelling discusses sort of how, I guess, the object holds its contradiction within itself. Am I sort of on the right track there, at least, perhaps, to maybe broadly? So I was thinking about the way that color works in terms of sense and whatnot is all the colors of the spectrum are absorbed except for one, and that's what gets reflected. So it's like, I don't know, I thought there was something to do with this identity or difference, or I don't know, I thought that was just interesting relative to, this sort of broad frequency and absorbing the opposites, or I don't know, maybe it's reflecting the opposite or
You're
the
right. You're right.
contradiction.
So in Deleuze, this is called univocity, right? The univocity of being. And so what's going on is that the two predicates, being and what is, together, they're the one, which is the identity. They express the one. But as expressible, they have the potential to be actualized. And so they're kind of like your two hands. I always talk about this. Your left and right hand are made of the same entities, right? They're flesh, bone, blood, but they're different. They're different in the sense that they're spatially located different, yet they can be brought together, but they're
Right.
still different in themselves, right? Your left is not your right, but they mimic this organism that is your two hands clasped together, or the fact that you can use them, or you can use your hand to create things. So he gives this example of the eye's power to see and vision. So there's these two plays, these two expressive plays of the function of them, yet they're still maintained. Their identity is still maintained.
The what is and the in being for Schelling, maybe there's not a lot of difference between Deleuze's virtual and actual here, and maybe just going back to like the influence of Leibniz on both Schelling and Deleuze. I'm assuming that that's probably just in the German tradition. It feels like that would have to be influential on Schelling, but I don't know if you have a response.
Actually, you want to know the funny thing about that is where Deleuze would call it intensive, Schelling would call it dramatic.
Interesting.
Really. So
I could see that. Yeah.
So the virtual, see, this is the one thing where they're very connected, right?
Yeah.
In difference repetition, Deleuze talks about a thunderstorm, okay? It's my favorite example of DNR. And what he says is that in a thunderstorm, we humans are so used in this kind of Humean causation to realize that, when we see thunder, we see lightning. But that's not what happens. What happens is warm air rises, cold air falls down, condensation comes together. So there's these kind of virtual intensities, these virtual forces, larval selves being connected together. Then finally, we get this swirl of forces or potencies in the Schellingian term.
Yep.
And then, boom, thunder happens, because now what's happened is the forces have somehow been put together to an assemblage or a multiplicity. And then we realize the individuation of the storm by the lightning clap. Now, notice just in the Schellingian terms and the Deleuzian terms, how this entire process is the event of the thunderstorm, and not just, I don't want to beat up on Hegel, but Hegel would agree with the kind of Humean example of thunder, lightning, that's the semblance, that's the synthesis. And yet there's this kind of relational power here going on, where there's hot and cold air, condensation, and then finally the clap of thunder. And so you're totally right here. So being as the real and the what is as this ideal, they are in the same process, stretched between these two processes. One grounds the other, while the other comes into action. And he'll say things like, a human being can be expressive of both love and wrathfulness. But when they're loving, they're not wrathful, but they still have that potential, right? That ability, or to use Schelling's language, the expressible potentiality to be both wrathful at one point and loving at the other time. So he's not naive in the sense that he knows that being is filled with a multiple predicate. Schelling is kind of a logician here, so he'll say predicates. Deleuze will say larval selves or potentialities, or even nomadic selves, bustling, right?
And I do think that it's interesting you bring up some of this, because I'm thinking about not only in the thunderstorm example of the forces of contraction and expansion, right, that occur to create that burst of sound that we think of as thunder, but I'm also thinking of this interesting way of relating love and wrath, or love and anger, which I know that at least Schelling talks about it in many ways, but Simondon kind of notes that love and wrath have to be united for, what does he say? For the love unites with wrath to create the wisdom of the world soul. This is kind of how he summarizes Schelling. And it makes sense that love and wrath wouldn't necessarily be opposed, because they both indicate passion. The opposite of love and wrath would be, I wouldn't want to use Schelling's term indifference here but it would be dispassionate removal or something like this, right? It would be the lack of passion.
They're united by the unconditioned, right? Or the indifference. And yet at the same time, you're right, they are united, but you can't be, you can't have a blurring of the two of them, right? When you're
Mhm.
loving someone or you're loving your partner, you're loving your partner. When you're upset with the world, you're kind of wrathful or you're upset. And so there's these multiple predicates or multiple powers or potencies that are in fluctuation. While one is grounding the other, you're in movement. You're in that movement of love, or you're in that movement of wrathfulness or anger, as Schelling says. And this is the dynamic of Jakob Burma, right? This is Burma's
Mhm.
influence, why we read that point about darkness and light and love and wrathfulness. So it goes back to kind of Burma's theosophical philosophy. And the funny thing is that Deleuze, oh my god, Schelling was very influenced. See, look, some Freudian stuff is coming up here. Schelling was very influenced by the theosophical tradition, but he knew he was not a mystic or a theosopher or a theologian. He was someone that took these concepts and made them philosophical.
I was trying to talk to Coop last night, maybe in a confused way, but I was trying to figure out, and I don't want to necessarily bring in Zizek and Lacan and these other thinkers through the back door, even though that's perhaps my fault for reading Zizek's introduction in this volume first. But I was wondering what you would make of, for example, I know that Schelling himself refers to God. You mentioned Godhead. There's also Simondon references an Uber Gottheit, this like supreme super divinity or something like this, because you made this point that I was about to call him Zizek, that Schelling isn't a theosopher, a theologian. What do we make of God here? Is it meant to be kind of an empty concept not an empty concept, that's not even right. Is it meant to be taken, maybe not in the sense, obviously, of like a Christian personal God, but more of sort of giving a word to some sort of cosmic force? Because you also mentioned that Schelling is kind of opposed to the simple teleological vision of Hegel. So I'm kind of wondering if you can unpack perhaps, and maybe this is too big of a question, but if you can unpack perhaps what God, at least for you in your reading, is kind of doing for Schelling in a text like this.
First and foremost, there's a difference between content and form. So we can say that the content is the mythos. So this could be like the mythos of Christianity. And the form itself is the logos, the word. Now, I'm not trying to bring in the beginning was the word and the beginning was flesh, or I'm not trying to bring up that passage from the Bible. What I'm saying is that why this is such a beautiful passage is because at the end of the Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, if one were to go past reason, not only would you make reason dizzy, which he would go beyond the abyss of reason. And Schelling says in the third draft of this, Ages of the World, that he is going to go beyond all noumena and go beyond the abyss of reason. And so what is the abyss of reason but the beginning of all beginning? The beginnings that we, as Meillassoux calls the ancestral event, that we've never experienced, we cannot cognize. And so what he's doing is, rather than doing the old, again, to beat up on Hegel, the science of logic, the doctrine of being, where we're flipping from being to non-being and then finally becoming, Schelling is saying, no, that's a false dichotomy. We need to start from the beginning of all beginnings. And what is this beginning? It's this unprethinkable moment. How can we start thinking about this moment? Well, we have the same forces, right? The contractive and expansive force that was in that first moment. So he kind of extracts backwards this moment and allows the content and form of mythos and logos to guide the structure. So it's as Jason Wirth says, it's a cosmic poem. Now, the way that I read it, I'm not very religious, so I read this as a kind of cosmic principle, like you just said, like Whitehead's God, this superjective creative process, or even Bergson's kind of, for me, the Godhead would be like the elan vital in creative evolution. Basically, what we get is this, I like saying it like this. Imagine a seed, okay? A seed. We're not going to play the Hegel game here. Imagine a seed by itself. A seed without soil or air or water or light would live on eternally unless there's no stimuli to make it unfold. However, you take that seed and you put it into a situation where there is stimulus. What happens? The seed cracks. Half the shell, falls away becomes the so-called unconscious. And the other side that's submerged in the soil becomes consciousness in the present. It unfolds, it plants its roots down, it starts moving forward, expanding. But what Schelling is trying to say to us is that these contractive and expansive forces that start off with this process of the seed, what they show us is the will that wills nothing, this empty ground, is this moment of contraction in all life. And this will that wills something, this expansive force, is something that's always expanding and attracting. Now, here's the problem with it. It's kind of like a Russian doll or a circle. If you could imagine the outline of the circle to be the eternal or the Godhead, you would have an infinite amount of circles inside, which are the potencies. Essentially, what he's saying is we have this, in Greek terms, aperon, this boundary. But when you put a boundary around a boundary, that itself is a boundary, and you get this paradox, this infinite regress. So Schelling is literally saying that this unconditioned is the binding of these forces that are emergent, right? They're emergent processes. This is why I love this text. It's the first kind of philosophical emergentism that is unfolding. And so essentially, God is this eternal outline of the circle. Let's call it this. The unconditioned is this moment, this outlining of the circle. For people that are listening, I'm actually drawing a circle in virtuality in the middle of the air. And so all the other circles they're unfolding. But the funny thing about this is that, in the freedom essay, Schelling uses the term the Ungrund, which is absolute indifference. And this is a term from Jakob Böhme. And that's the copula. That's the is that binds the A and the B, or the X that binds the A and the B, the two predicates. So there's always a third. The third is this dynamic placeholder that allows the predicates to unfold. It's the indifference that in German, unbedingt, literally means the unthinged. It's an unthinged, it's an undifferentiated relational potency. So that allows for difference and relation and all of these things to unfold. So he's really playing. Oh my God, I'm again seeing another connection. Where Deleuze starts talking about transcendental empiricism. And the reason why he likes that term is the paradox between transcendence and empiricism, the transcendental. And then he talks about this line between the zeros. It's exactly the same thing. There's this boundary of the paradox between the unconditioned and the conditioned. And because we can never cognize that first ancestral event, what we're left with is the emergence of these forces that are unraveling and that are still kind of held together by this abyss of reason, or this Ungrund, or this Godhead. And as Simondon said, this Ubersein, what did he call it? The Uber-Gottheit?
Yeah, that's right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazing. It's a beautiful line. So it is that. The Godhead is this kind of creative principle that's allowing for the potencies or the rotary motion to unfold. But we have to really think of, there's a difference, because later on in the text, he starts talking about eternal being and the eternal what is. That's pure identity. So that's the outline of the circle. But the inside of the circle would be being and what it. I'm sorry if I'm not complicating this.
No. I you're not. Actually, Cooper and I were talking about this last night a little bit. When I tried to use Zizek's discussion of the phallus as the empty sign, as the empty signifier.
Yes.
And I was trying to say that perhaps, thinking through Deleuze, Schelling, this question of the differential, that the phallus as the empty signifier would be the bar, if you will, that allows for dy dx to differentiate. And so you're actually kind of, and again, I don't want to necessarily call, this is maybe why I was saying God was this empty signifier in Lacanese, as Zizek speaks, in Zizek speak, to stick with Simondon too, would be this means by which metastability can allow to, at least to orders of magnitude, to kind of create a disparation, as he calls it, right? A disparate resolution and resonance, because the way you were describing the seed in terms of Schelling reminded me of how Simondon describes the crystal, right? Because a crystal, a crystalline germ without a mother liquor, without some kind of surrounding milieu to annex and to feed off of, would remain dormant, just like the seed, as you said. It takes a kind of it takes a solution in which to be immersed. It takes some sort of stimuli, as you mentioned.
I feel like time and motion here are the kind of unspoken terms, perhaps.
This-
Maybe
this-
this would go to like
Mhm.
the Deleuze cinema, like the time image and movement image here. But I don't know. That's just kind of what I was picking up on. I don't know if that has any actual relevance.
It's so funny because my favorite part of the cinema books are when Deleuze is talking about montage from film noir, where it's, situation, action, situation, or ASA. And then after World War II, when we become fragmented and we no longer believe in the world, that situation, action is severed. And it's so funny that the same thing happens in Schelling. There's a trauma that happens that allows for personality to kind of emerge. Schelling calls it personality. He hates the word subjectivity. He'll talk about subject and object as predicates, but he thinks the personal is a lot different. It's more than just one force. But no, you're totally right here. And there is a very fine line between the emergent of time in the circle and eternity outside of the circle, right? So there's this kind of play on the paradox that's so great. I forgot the Riemann example of the dy and the dx. I'm totally getting that wrong, probably.
No, you're not.
But you're right. You're right. Absolutely. So that's what he's playing on. I'm so glad to talk to you guys about this. It's great.
No. This is good because too, when you brought up when Deleuze describes red and the different intensities of red as a differential, we talked to Simon Duffy about this because Maimon brings up this kind of example. And so it's interesting too that you also see Schelling working through the differential, maybe not as directly mathematically, but still in his own way, weaving in this and obviously this points back to what Coop said about sort of it being a inheriting some of Leibniz's, maybe not terminology, but at least
like the paradigm of thought, perhaps, I think.
Yeah, the paradigm, maybe some of the theodicy, if you will.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
No, for sure. So yes. Let's say it's a theodicy without the inherent morality, right? Like without the moral harmoniousness, right? Like Schelling realizes, yes, at the end of the freedom essay, love conquers all. This is why I call Interstellar a Schellingian movie, because love conquers all.
That's wonderful.
Love is not spatial. Love is just like cosmic. It's so funny. But yeah, in a sense, that's the kind of the heartbeat of the film. And it's so true. So I'm seeing a lot more connections.
But this actually kind of gets to, and Coop has it here, the death drive in Schelling. One of the ways that,
if you don't mind, I just want to bump in real quick, but before we move on, because something Christopher said that I thought was kind of interesting was to go back to the sort of dice throw from Deleuze. What I think is kind of interesting, and this even could be metaphor for like the seed example too, is that, okay, so the potentialities of the die, the 6 types of rolls you can get on a single die, all those potentials are there. I like this idea of even expanding that out, like the notion of the color spectrum, which I guess would be energy itself, or like electromagnetism, or would have you right that
It would be.
that spectrum of Roy G. Biv, those 8 potentialities are available. Those are available to be actualized. What's interesting, though, on top of that, is that not only do you have the ability to actualize any variation of those 8 colors, it's also the intensity of, then you can have a sub-intensity of each different type of color that gets reflected back. I don't know if that is necessarily relevant to Schelling, but I don't know. That just kind of, I thought that was a way to sort of make that a more elegant example of how maybe Deleuze thinks about difference, but I don't know.
No, they both have a kind of organic understanding of continuum, right? So it's not a blending, but it's an unfolding, right? It's an unfolding of each degree, right? Like when Deleuze talks about the degrees of redness, he literally means like each pixel is its own entity unfolding in this pixelation. Even the word pixel and pixelation, right? Or I don't even know if that's a word, but
yeah, it is.
Even at the middle, right? Like Deleuze always talks about the middle, or the folds of lines and stuff like that. So there's all of this. You both are hitting all the marks. So you're doing very, very well. This is one of the best conversations I've had about the ages of the world. Maybe the background to reading Schelling is Deleuze. So there you go. Maybe
it's possible. I know that we really haven't. A lot of the time when we discuss text, we try not to necessarily dive into exegesis, but I think that talking about these things in broad terms, which is perhaps the one merit of Zizek's, sometimes not even talking about Schelling by talking about Hegel or talking about Lacan. Maybe I mentioned this to you, but Zizek's book, Organs Without Bodies, on Deleuze, it's like 20 pages on Deleuze and then 200 pages on Hegel. And I always thought of it as a joke, right? That, I'm going to talk about Deleuze, but actually you're getting Hegel, and that's the joke that actually Deleuze is Hegel or something like this, right? Some kind of buggery. But I've also talked to some of my Slovenian friends who kind of mentioned that this is known in those circles. And again, this is just opinion and anecdote, but this is known in Slovenian circles as one of Zizek's worst books, that it wasn't a joke, it was meant seriously, and that it was taken quite poorly, if you will. Again, this is just an opinion that I've heard from, I won't name names, but but the point being, there is a lot of that introduction to this work by Schelling that isn't about Schelling. And yet at the same time, you can see little parts of it that allow for a way of maybe getting into the text that sometimes feels like there is a barrier to sort of understanding what Schelling's doing. And so one of the things that I thought was interesting about the way that Zizek talked about the death drive very briefly was this fact that, Eros and Thanatos, in Freud's terms, for example, that Eros is constantly kind of trying to, if you will, expand and unite and build, and death drive or Thanatos is actually trying to end that ceaseless surplus. I'm kind of wondering about this with your point about love conquering all. Is there a place for this process to perhaps lapse back in on itself, or is that the force of wrath, or am I simplifying too much? I feel like I am.
No. But just if you don't mind, I'm just going to give a little background to the freedom essay, because there's more about the freedom essay. And this has a lot to do with the Kabbalah elements that are inherent in Jakob Burma. And of course, Zizek doesn't like this element of it. This is why Zizek relates it to the death drive, he relates it to the unconscious, and that's fine. But really, essentially what's going on is this. The creation of God as a macro event, the same creation that's going on with God is going to also happen with the human. So it's interesting. There's a macro and a micro level going on here. So what happens is that God negates himself. So the Godhead, or the Ungrund, negates itself. It contracts inward on itself, just like the seed. And what happens is, out of that, a receptacle comes. So this is straight out of Kabbalah. This is the Zimzum.
Okay.
And out of this space of nothingness, the receptacle is formed where prima materia, so prime matter, primordial matter, emerges in this space now that God has created, this ground. And at the same time, the ground doesn't have any principles. It doesn't have any of God's essence, right? It's just darkness, sheer darkness, sheer egoity. It wants its own interiority, like the seed. It wants to live for eternality. It craves to be back with God at the same time. So it is God, but it isn't God. So here again, Lacan, right? We have the mirror stage where the young child is looking into the mirror and seeing, this is me adding to the mirror stage, I'm sorry, before language. And you notice how, when a child looks in the mirror, because they can't see their own face or anything, they see the gestures of the mirror. The mirror gives content to this individual, right?
Yeah, and unity.
We have the same kind of thing going on. And actually, this is where I'll get there in a second. There's a lot of stuff to unpack here. So this ground, which is part of, it's part of God's receptacle now in time. Well, God's this, outline. He's in the outline of the circle. If we go back to the circle example, what's going on is this blind drive, this blind craving that wants to go back to the one, but it can't, right? It's been negated. Half of this pomp has been removed. And he's really using these kind of alchemical terms. Same with Schelling too. He literally means this negation into itself, this contraction into itself. It's like pulling stuff out into a space. So it's co-eternal with it. And this is why we're always linked to this absolute identity. So there's no word there. There's no reason there. It's the unreason, which Schelling will say, the darkness that comes before the light. It's gravity before light. It's wrathfulness before love. Because what is wrathfulness? You're so absorbed in your own self that you need to consume and drag everything into you.
Yeah.
So what happens is that the word is put in. So just like in Lacan, when language forms, you may have to help me here. It's been a while since I've read Lacan. But when language happens, language is formed in the child, it's a little better, right? The stages are, I think the child starts mimicking certain things. Am I right or am I wrong?
When we sort of enter language by stages, as you kind of already said, there's a sense in which the child is born without an unconscious, without an ego, without all these things. But it's when we sort of enter into language, we enter into law, the big other, we sort of, this is the state of castration and all of these things. I mean, obviously moving very quickly and sort of just summarizing, but it's that, I guess it's that entering into the domain of law. There, I mean, Zizek talks about this a little bit, right? Where Schelling's three fragments or three versions of the ages of the world sort of deal with this tension between law and love. Not to bring in another dichotomy between, we were talking about law and wrath, or love and wrath, but now this question of how the second tries to move beyond law or something.
I'm going to get there. I'm going to get there in 1 second. There's a Bible passage in this text, okay, from Proverbs 8:23-31. And in this passage, it's my favorite passage, the divine feminine, Sophia, helps God, who's unconscious, God, the creator, the Godhead, is unconscious, fills in the content of God. So Sophia, the divine feminine, says, I was there when the horizons were formed. I was there when the oceans were filled. I was there when humankind was created. Schelling's playing on this as well. He doesn't really mean that. He's talking about this unconscious ground that's yearning to be knowledgeable. And so it's Sophia is this mirror of consciousness. She's the one that allows content and form to come together. And so reason or language, when it becomes part of the ground now is able to articulate its desires. It's able to articulate its loneliness, its wrathfulness. There's no love yet. There's no love yet. So what appears first is the first stirrings of existence, of divine existence. But as it starts building, when there's this pull between, as you said, when one conquers the other. So what's going on is there's a kind of decision to split. Same thing in Burma. And notice in German, the word is Entscheidung. If you remove the ENT and you have Scheidung, you have scission. So in a decision, there's a scission between two things.
Yeah.
So what happens is that Schelling calls evil egoism, which is, pure self-absorbedness, pure drive, pure, putting yourself before others. And ipseity, individuality, is a balance of the center. It's allowing the flow of movement and allowing to ground one of the principles. So there is this moment of becoming, this moment where the ground we decide, in a sense, on these two characteristics. We decide between the two of them in the freedom essay. So it's kind of like each personal individual looks at themselves at this point and decides whether they want to be at the periphery, allowing the flow of wrath to overtake the love principle, or going to the center where there's balance, where there's movement, right? So if you think of, if there's balance, if we're centered, then they can flow around like a rotary position. But if you flow to the periphery, one gets blocked and it needs to be overcome. What's going on in this kind of dynamic pull and push is that what he's trying to say is, and I'm sorry if I'm being too abstract, when we change as individuals, when we change and something happens to us, we don't realize the change. Our friends notice the change. Change occurs, and it occurs inside us, not outside. Something takes over us. And this is what Schelling is trying to get at. When this moment of evil or this moment of character is absorbed or overcome, these moods take us over, the same thing happens. We flee to the periphery and we're blocked until we need to overcome this moment. So it's oddly existential as well, too. He's talking about the character traits of this, but everything comes back to this unconscious play of these forces and this is why the dark principle and wrath is always in all individuals, all beings, even nature. Nature has it as well, too, because it started off as this cell of this ground that was desiring and wanting And it needed reason or language to express this, and it needed a balance of it. And so Schelling will say it's the word, right? It's the word, or from the Bible or whatever, and that it needs to be incarnated in Jesus. But if you don't want to read the Christianity in it, which I don't tend to do, I don't tend to do that. What it's showing is that a person is born with these forces, just like the seed. It has the potential to grow into a plant, but it also has the potential to gain a disease. It has the potential to become sick. And all of these potentials, these forces, affect the character and the personality or the difference of each individual. And so there's a constant struggle. And what Zizek likes about this is that we're born into these drives. We're born into this cycle of drives that you can never get out of. The rotary position, it's there. It's primordial. It's cosmic, is what he's getting at. And the brilliance of this is that we are stuck in this cycle. There's no way of getting out of it. So it is a theodicy in a sense, but it's also not naive that, everything's great in the end.
Right.
No, there is suffering. There is contradiction. And we need to suffer in a sense in order to understand this process. Or we would, I don't know if that makes any sense, but
I think it does.
Time is the fire in which we burn. That would probably
Perfect. Yeah, no, perfect.
I don't think that time could quite be the ground, but it almost seems like it provides the ground for, like I said earlier, kind of like for movement, for change itself. Just to even think back to something like Ligotti's notion of nothing can change outside of time. There are entities that sort of create universes to grow their children in a sense, like they unfold into these godlike creatures that are, dimensions above our perception.
But you're right. As God or the unconditioned is creating itself, it creates a boundary around us. So you'll see at the end of the text where he starts talking about the eternal being and then the eternal what is. So that's the kind of boundary or the aperon, the border around the circle. And the other potencies, the love and wrathful principle, the being and what is, are the encircling circles within it. So you're seeing an entire cosmic emergence going on through the text. Hopefully I'm doing justice to the text, and hopefully I'm getting you interested in the text.
I think you are, and there was something...
Can I just read you one passage?
Please.
So this is a perfect passage. It's towards the end. It's got Jakob Burma written all over it. And remember, the unconscious past, it's that moment where the receptacle becomes filled with these emergent properties, with prime matter, prima materia, and concealment or shrouding yourself in, all of these are happening to the Godhead. And there's always this, indifferent principle binding everything together, but allowing for flow. So he says on page 179, at the very bottom, my favorite passage of this text, darkness and concealment are the dominant characteristics of primordial time. When time formed, when time became concrete, it was when the receptacle became filled. When the receptacle formed, that's time. There's a difference now between inside the circle and outside the circle, right? Inside the circle's time, outside the circle is eternality. Just like we were talking about Riemann and the dx and the dy, the paradox between them. So he says, all life first becomes and develops in the night. All life, right, becomes and develops in the ground, in this dark, desirous ground, this ego, this egotistical essence. The ancients called the night the fertile mother of things, and indeed together with chaos, the oldest of beings. So in the Timaeus, when the demiurgos is creating the cosmos and ensouling everything, Plato calls it the grand artesian. So what Schelling is doing, he's playing on the Timaeus, but he's adding some more dynamic elements to it, some more personal elements. The unconscious, drive, sexuality, personality. And then he says, the deeper we return into the past, the more we find the unmoving rest, indistinction, and indifference, coexistence of the very forces, though gentle at the beginning, flare up later into even more turbulent struggle. The mountains of the primordial world seem to look down upon the animated life at their feet with eternally mute indifference, and likewise with the oldest formations of the human spirit. So everything is churning and forming at the same time, the macro and the micro. And each is becoming, in a sense. Each is overcoming this struggle of the principles. Even the cosmos, right? The cosmos is being formed in this receptacle, in this ground, and it's going through these two principles, real and ideal, and it's being stretched between them, in a sense. Does that make sense?
I think that what's interesting is this sort of notion that before time was formed, that time arises out of eternity, rather than eternity being what Hegel might call the bad infinite, which is just a series
Right.
of integers added up together, where if you took time and sort of, you go from zero to infinity, or to just the boundaries, that for Schelling, that's the same way. That's not a good way to think of it, that eternity is that primordial, rotary drive that you mentioned, and it's out of that sort of conflict of forces that then time appears, rather than sort of eternity appearing at the end. It is even before the beginning, because the beginning itself sort of retrojects eternity back as what Zizek was calling the unconscious, right? This past that has never passed, if you will. It's this primordial past that, I don't want to call it the ground or the abyss or whatever, just a confused terminology, but I found that interesting, right? Rather than eternity being at the end or being a teleological or totalizing unity, it is this before time that is also, I know here he says above time, or he talks about above time, but it's kind of like not even beneath time. It's not even, in a certain sense, in time. Like time is outside of it. I think that's counterintuitive to the connotation of eternity as the totality of all time.
When he says at the beginning of the text, the past is known, the present is recognized, the future is divine. What is known is recounted, what is recognized is presented, what is divine is prophesied. And then he says science, so Wissenschaft, he's talking about the Geisteswissenschaft, so the human sciences, is history, but not history in an Aristotelian sense, where we have a succession of events that are so-called linked. What we have is an organic continuum, right? A process. And we have this unfolding, this moment where the border or the apeiron, the indifference or the unconditioned, which is this,
the unlimited.
This unlimited relational entity is building this border around what time is going to unfold in this receptacle. And so we have this connection between time in the middle, in this, circling and circling and circling, and then we have this eternal kind of boundary. And so he's playing on this. He's playing on everything. So there's so much, opposites are linked. They're not identical, but they're always continuously unfolding. So while one is unfolding, one is enfolding, and we have this contractive and expansive process, and attraction as well, which is the third, which is attracting things together, pulling things together. I don't know if I answered your question. I
guess I didn't have a question. I was kind of reflecting on the passages that you just read, and I was kind of thinking about how, this vision of, or what he calls eternity, is counter to what one would perhaps just think in everyday terms. And I suppose because we've kind of gone through some of the terminology and maybe step back and sort of ask a bigger question. I know Zizek mentions, but doesn't really get to it. I'm wondering what your opinion is on perhaps why Schelling, well, first of all, the three versions of this text that we have only consider the past, right? Supposedly there were supposed to be three parts, as you mentioned, one on the past, the present, and the future. Do you have any opinions or maybe even scholarly informed ideas about why Schelling abandoned this project or didn't see it through? Was there something perhaps that because I know Schelling kind of, or Zizek talks about the early, middle, late Schelling. So do you think that there was something that didn't quite work for him in terms of abandoning this project?
I'm really glad you asked that, because this is what my dissertation's on, actually.
Oh, okay, good.
So number one, there's 4 drafts of it. There's an 1818 draft that nobody cites because we only have 10 to 12 sheets. So it is speculated that Schelling wrote 20 versions of this.
Wow.
But we lost it all in the 1944 bombing raid in Munich. Oh, sorry, in Berlin, sorry. So this is how I divide them up. I was actually presenting a paper on this at the North American Schelling Society, and I was speaking to a gentleman named Philip Hofel, who's also loves the ages of the world, and we were talking about what we like about it. And I said this to him, and he agreed. He said, so for me, the 1811 and the 1813, okay, so the 1811 is just maybe 30 more pages than the one that we read, the second draft.
Is that the first draft, quote unquote? The
Yeah,
1811?
So the 1811 draft, I have it right here. So this draft here, which actually has chapters in it. There's chapters on pantheism, there's chapters on, so it's very tragic. It's almost written like a mythology in a sense, which he returns to later in his last work, The Philosophy of Mythology. Now, the reason why Zizek likes this is because it's very personable. It starts talking about how the cosmic is then reflected into the individual, the personal. And there's so much more on the drives.
It's tailored to his psychoanalytic and dialectical materialist penchant, if you will.
Yes, and the 1815, which we've always had, for me, is different because, you see, Schelling was trying to create a new system. He was trying to reflect on a new metaphysics. And he did this later in his Philosophy of Revelation. I'm going to read you just the link. I'm going to show you what happened. Now, Schelling's son, Carl, only published the 1815 version because it was the longest.
The third edition, which I think that was translated very quickly, right? I mean, it's been around in English for a long time, at least as I saw.
Now, the 1811 draft, the first draft, the interesting thing about it is that what they did was they added all of the notes. They added all of Schelling's notes and extra drafts that are really, really interesting so you can read it. It's fascinating. But in the Philosophy of Revelation, which for me is the culmination of the ages, like he finishes the ages in his final project called the Philosophy of Revelation. And listen what he says here. This is actually how this is how I start my dissertation off. He says, "It is well advised to first conclude on the past. The positive philosophy is a future for the now largely prevailing philosophical consciousness." So the Ages of the World starts off as a philosophical text on the unconscious cosmos that's unfolding. And it's always called a failure because he never finished it. But really what I think happened was when he realized that the past is this cosmological beginning, but now we have to talk more about a systematic way of understanding it. He makes this concept called the unprethinkable, which I brought up before, this uncognizable entity at the beginning because it's an ancestral event. And so what he does in this text, the Philosophy of Revelation, I don't want to talk too much about text, is he fixes the potencies. He kind of reflects on the potencies, the powers, about how the cosmos unfolds, and he gives more detailed into the unconscious, this unprethinkable kind of creative elan that helps, let's say, flush out the personal and everything else. You know, the one thing about the ages that I like so much, the more that the James Webb satellite takes images of the cosmos, and we're starting to realize that there may be more to the picture than just the Big Bang, and it's so much more. I think Schelling is really, really important to return to now. The one thing that I disagree with between the flux of philosophy and science is that I think that, as Deleuze says too, philosophers and scientists should be working together for life. They should be helping each other out. This may not be the right project. It may be wrong, but at least it can help people reflect on how things unfolded, both cosmologically, theologically, and existentially when it comes to our own human being and our world and our reality. And so for me, it's not a failed project because he fixes it all. He kind of completes it in his late lectures in Berlin, which altogether are, they sum up 900 pages. It's a massive project. It's just a huge project. But he was attacked so much for the freedom essay that he kind of became a hermit. So he taught in Munich for a long, long time and then went to Berlin after. But I think he was really kind of fearful of publishing again because what he had been yelled out of Bavaria by the Catholics. The Catholics hated him. He was a Protestant boy, talking about the ages of the world, the system of the ages of the world, are his lectures from Erlangen and to Munich, and people did not like this. He would have constant scenes where people would emerge into his classroom and just shout him down, and he would just be like, oh God. Just like Deleuze, too. Deleuze had the same thing happen to him as well, too.
I mean, yeah, Badu was one of the antagonists, right? So that is interesting, though, about how much. I mean, I suppose it's back to the question about the status of God. I mean, I suppose that would be one of the things that the Catholics would not have liked about what he was doing was, in a way, I mean, I suppose that by philosophically ruminating on God in a way that perhaps is counter to a scriptural fundamentalist reading of text, or for Catholics, I guess the whatever doctrine would be established. I suppose that would, I guess he's not the only one, though. You can think of Spinoza is just an easy example of another thinker who is thinking about God in a way that isn't the same as Schelling, but still has heretical, I mean, not for me, but for the powers that be, right? Has heretical overtones.
And Schelling was a Spinozist for a very long time. He actually...
Interesting.
I'll tell you something funny, okay? You ready for this? I should have said this at the beginning of the podcast. Here's Schelling and here's Spinoza. What's Spinoza's system? Substance. What is substance? Well, substance is one substance that is in itself and through itself. It has an infinite amount of attributes, and it's got modes. And it's also natura, naturans, and natura, naturata. Now, what's Schelling's system? Instead of Deo siva natura, it's Deo siva vernunft. So God is reason.
Right.
Right? And instead of natura naturans, we have being. And instead of natura naturata, we have what is. So he's just kind of made Spinoza a little more organic.
Yeah.
Kind of spiritualized it, made it a little more non-deterministic, right? A little more expressive. Expressive.
Okay. That's ironic considering Deleuze's book on Spinoza and the problem of expression, and how even if it's not a concept for Spinoza, it's an interesting way of trying to understand how substance is expressed through the modes, etc. And so I wondered about this too, where the translator has a note in the version that we read for today about the expressing, the expressible, and the expressed. Is there something similar going on here with Schelling? This question, I mean, obviously this relates back to the word as you mentioned it, but is there something about, let's just say, the advent of the expressing, this sort of event, if you will, or advent of the expressed, expressing, etc. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So as he says, expression, so the expressing is the expressing of the one, not the one like in Plato or Plotinus or any kind of Neoplatonic structure. It's the unconditioned. It can express this unconditioned, right? Now, the expressible is the virtual. It's the potential. And as the potential is the expressible. It can express these predicates or express these acts of being or these modes of being. Let's use Spinoza's term.
Sure.
And then there's the express, where one of the modes or one of the predicates grounds the other.
Okay.
Right? So love and wrath, right? And they kind of flip higher and lower. There are three ways. Those three ways are the three potencies. So there's the expressing, the expressible, and the expressed, all in these structures. So in Schelling's nature philosophy, he calls the unconditioned absolute productivity. And what is absolute productivity? It's this flow, right? Like a river in a sense. And how do products form out of productivity? There's inhibition. And what's it called? And Zizek in his text calls it anstos, the fiction anstos, inhibition.
Right.
So when inhibition happens, when there's an obstacle, a product is formed out of this productivity. Notice they still have the same essence in the sense that they share the same univocity of being or the entity of identity from the unconditioned, yet they're still different. And they're expressed as opposed to expressible or expressing.
Right.
Right? he really means that it's like two sides of a coin. Being and what is are two sides of the coin, and the third is the coin itself, the whole coin, let's say, if you have
Right.
to use it that way. But when one is expressed, you can only see heads
Yeah.
as opposed to tails. And the mode of the expressible would be like flipping the coin and having it spinning and spinning around. You don't know which you're going to get. They're infinitely just spinning. There's this potential for whatever to be individuated or to be expressed.
This is making me think about the way that you're formulating it. And I don't know if you're doing it consciously or unconsciously, or maybe this is my reading. You're making me think about the way that Deleuze talks about intensive difference and its explication.
Yes.
Right? There's a way in which quality explicates these intensive differences. There's something very similar going on. And so I can see why he would praise Schelling for, in say the different potencies of already formulating a kind of principle of differentiation.
Absolutely. I think you're spot on there, especially that the fact that you talked about the qualitative.
Is that like
Yeah.
kind of what I was getting at with the intensities of the colors?
I think so.
Taylor, like I
Yeah.
kind of feel like maybe we're on the same page there.
I think that's what you were explicating.
Yeah, I
not the
was
pun.
kind of trying to communicate. I think you did it a little better. Yeah.
I was just using Deleuzian terminology, but yeah, if we go back to your analogy of the light spectrum, you're right. There is a sense in which white light, for example, and Deleuze himself uses that
Yeah.
terminology of the white light being sort of qualitatively expressible, to use, or being able to be explicated in these different wavelengths. So I think that you're actually, without knowing it, you're actually using an example that Deleuze uses throughout difference and repetition. If I remember correctly, Christopher, right? He talks about problems and their solutions in these terms. Like he'll even talk about white as being sort of the way in which problems can be determined and determinable in these different cases of solution.
Light would be the ground for these possibilities of expression.
The funny thing, oh my God, I'm thinking even more. I'm realizing even more connections. When Deleuze talks about how white is in every color,
yes,
and black is the absence of color, it's so funny because white would be like the identity principle, it would be the unconditioned,
Right.
while all the other colors are now unfolding. Right?
Yes.
This is totally acceptable to talk about it. Schelling will never say, I mean, in the nature philosophy, he does bring up the words intensity and extensity, but I think he likes this idea of it's a drama of powers, it's a drama of forces. And he'll always talk about how he's known for saying that nature is visible spirit. Spirit is invisible nature. They mimic each other. There's no subject and object. They're dynamically linked, like your two hands, as I was saying before, left and right. And the same processes are happening, but just there is this there's a kind of internal dynamic between the real and the ideal.
Yeah.
And this is always through him, just like Deleuze, the virtual and the actual. Yeah. And now I feel bad because you all wanted to take a little break from Deleuze and the whole.
It just shows how much we've tried to delve into some of Deleuze's work recently. And so I do apologize to the listener if they're getting tired of hearing Deleuze. It's good to try to unravel some of Schelling's terminology or any philosopher's terminology and sort of get them resonating and interacting with not just examples, but other thinkers, other terms, kind of like lubricating the conceptual network of ideas. It does help to sort of bring some of these things out when we're able to more or less transform and translate these systems and these terms in a way that gets them interacting. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. And that's just part of the history of philosophy, right? Is sort of, it's painting this portrait with these different hues.
So Schelling will actually say that each entity has its own freedom. So he gives this example of the human body. And he says, it's so funny that the eye can get sick, like the eye can get pink eye. But when you have pink eye, it's not like your mouth is sick or your hand, but there is some differential aspect there that's going on. Or even when you have an earache, right? Your whole body's not sick, just your ear is affected by something. So it's got this freedom to contract illness out of its freedom, out of its free action. So every entity has a free mode of expressivity this is something that he'll always say, that freedom is the alpha and the omega of philosophy. So he really is a philosopher of freedom, actually. And he's trying to show that even at the molecular level, the cosmic level, there is still this mode of freedom through these plays of forces, the contractive and the expansive. By the way, I feel bad. Like I kind of rushed over the death drive. I'm sorry.
We actually kind of talked about it in a certain way.
I have a passage I could read that I thought this is the one passage where to me it jumped out.
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. Go ahead. Yeah,
would be a good way to. There is a question that gets raised in childhood but grows tiring in mature age. Where has everything come from? But where everything has come from can be nowhere else than where everything is still coming from and where everything is going back to, and which was thus not only before time, but is still in every moment, constantly above time. For these reasons as well, the immovable will that wills nothing is first and highest. For the will that wills nothing always penetrates to the greatest turmoils of life and the most violent movement of all forces. Everything aims for it, everything longs for it. Every created thing, every man in particular strives, in truth, only to return to the condition of non-willing. Not only he who strips himself away from all desirable things, but though unknowingly he abandons himself to all desires. For this man too desires only the state in which he has nothing more to wish for, nothing more to want, even if that state retreats immediately from him, and the more zealously he pursues, the further away it is.
Beautiful passage. And notice the will that wills nothing is always linked with the contractive principle. So that's the wrathful principle. That's darkness. And that's also egoity. That's the darkness of the ground. That dark kind of, in the freedom essay, he calls it he says, I'm sorry to jump text here, but this is beautiful. And it also brings up what we've been talking about. He says, thus we must imagine the original yearning, right? So this is this dark kind of receptacle, as it directs itself to the understanding, though still not recognizing it, just as we in our yearning seek out an unknown and nameless good, as it moves divining itself like a wave-wound whirling sea, akin to Plato's matter, following dark, uncertain laws, incapable of constructing for itself anything enduring, but corresponding to the yearning, which is still the dark ground, is the first stirrings of an inner reflective representation that is generated in God himself, through which, since we have no other object but God, God sees himself in an exact image of himself. And this representation is the first in which God, considered as absolute, is realized, although only in himself. The representations is with God in the beginning and is God, who is begotten in God himself. So just like the passage that you brought up, Cooper, or Coop, sorry, it's the same empty moment of yearning, this decentered kind of dark, undulating sea of prime matter that is just all it wants to consume. It wants to sabotage itself by being this endless cycle of just desiring and desiring, desiring, desiring. And it has no essence of reason. It's the unreason. It's it's this principle that just wants to make everything into its own self. It's this contractive, and there's no end to its craving.
I also had a passage, and then we can discuss maybe all of these passages together. This is Simon Doan talking about Schelling, again, from the history of the notion of the individual, which is part 2 of individuation in light of notions of form and information. He says, nevertheless, Schelling does not limit the application of his method to the grasping of individual beings. He wants to conserve the quote-unquote continuity of forms also for the powers of nature and spirit. Thus, nature under its real and objective aspect is cohesion, under its ideal aspect is light, and as identity is gravity suffused with light or organism. But the singularity of individual beings disappears in the dispersal of identity. Their distinction, their will, their morality cannot be conserved. Already in Philosophy and Religion, 1804, Schelling acknowledged that finite being, unable to arise from the absolute, which remains in itself, must posit itself through an entirely free act, analogous to that which Plotinus lent to the souls that want to live for themselves and to detach themselves from the world soul. Like Burma and Eckhart, Schelling, wanting to make room for individual beings, is forced to resort to a mystical drama. In the beginning, this drama involves the existence of a non-individualized ground, a ground without light or consciousness, empty and poor desire. But Schelling is then, in fact, forced to introduce an already individualized being. And this is Simondon's just because he has to come back to, individuals. Schelling is forced to introduce an already individualized being. This is the spirit of God moved by love, which links the understanding to desire, pregnant with all the forms of existence and becoming the creative will of nature. This is cosmogonic becoming. Man is found at its culminating point. I'll finish here. In the natural being, each being's own will remains united with the universal will. In man, this will wants to exist by itself and become its universe to itself. Man consequently closes himself off from universal love. Theogonic becoming, or the return to God, begins with the fall of man. It is only in God that the foundation is immediately connected with existence. Outside it, the foundation only reaches existence through the intermediary of nature and history. There is consequently a sin in the individuality that wants to be complete and absolute. Only man realizes complete individuality. He realizes it in sin. This moment of complete individuality is therefore integrated into the totality of the drama. And then he goes on about God. But I thought
that's beautiful. What is that? I have to read this text now. Oh my gosh.
So this is volume 2 of Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information. And he's got this whole history of the notion of the individual, which starts with the pre-Socratics and goes up to Schelling is actually one of the last. It's the second to last. He ends with Novalis, Holderlin, and a geologist named Henrik Steffens, but that's the end. So Schelling is really kind of towards the end, and it's not really a critique, maybe, but it's one of his. I think Simondon's interested, obviously, as the text says, in the notion of the individual as it sort of goes throughout the history of thought, a history of philosophy. And I think that his one critique, right, is that it's interesting that while you do have the sort of non-individualized ground, the individuality that interacts with it is the spirit of God, so to speak. Right. And I think that for him is still not getting to a principle of individuation, right, which is what he wants to try to unearth and articulate. But I do think that he sees something obviously more interesting in Schelling than, say, his thoughts on Hegel or some of these other thinkers that perhaps aren't as dynamic or processual, if you will.
Okay, so this is something that Heidegger pointed out that I also think Simondon also picked out, that yes, Schelling is a philosophical Christian. And by philosophical Christian, I don't mean, one of those, he's not evangelical. He is ontotheological. So he's right that God's spirit is kind of the essence of identity. He's not wrong about that. That's totally true. And I think he's totally right about that as well. And what you just summed up is a perfect summation about the freedom essay and the ages of the world, this constant struggle, the tragedy, the drama, right? Life is a tragedy. It's a tragedy of these forces. Even to become the individual that we are is hard, right? We are led astray by our own desires. We can be consumed with them where we're so consumed by ourselves that we move to that periphery of that dark ground, and it's the most primal state of ourself. So that passage was beautiful, and I think it was really added well to our discussion.
What I also got out from his passage, and I do want to return to the passage Coop wrote about, because I have an interesting question, or at least a relation to make. But what I thought was interesting, when he actually, at the end of his dissertation, the first part of the book, Simondon writes about ethics, and his main point is, one of the main points he makes about ethics is for not to want, desire, strive to be this absolute, complete individual, that there's something immoral about that. And here he points it out. He finds it in Schelling with his, relating back to this question about sin. It's in sin that man microcosmically strives to attain this complete, absolute individuality. And I think that for Simondon, that is abstracting from the Christian theological mythos of the fall. He actually extracts a kind of ethical principle for why individuals themselves sort of have to die. There's actually something like ethical in it. And that's a totally longer story and unrelated.
But that's linked with Schelling. Like Schelling calls that the reverse God. where we make the ego the principle as opposed to the center of individuality. And what happens is we try to make ourselves like that absolute. We try to drag that principle into our center. And what happens is we decenter ourselves to the point where now we're the reverse God. We're the rogue monad, as Schelling says later in
Interesting.
in the third draft, actually. And so what happens is that we become so consumed with ourselves. And this is that wrathful moment. This is where we see ourselves as greater, and we're not able to look behind that glass wall or peer over it.
And so in Cooper's section, where that sort of man desires the state in which he has nothing more to wish for, I wonder, the Nietzschean in me kind of like jumps out and wonders if this is too close to kind of Schopenhauer's, his Buddhistic type of willing towards nirvana. Because Freud himself too thought of the pleasure principle in some senses as the nirvana principle, right? Is like total evacuation of excitation. So I'm wondering if there's something
that would be the rest, right?
Well,
that's required, the requisite state of rest.
So that's kind of what I'm wondering, is this perhaps similar, this striving towards willing nothing? Is he finding this sort of as a higher principle for us? Because that's where perhaps I've read too much Nietzsche and think like, oh no, that's decadence. That's perhaps this that's exhaustion, right? That's
Schelling wants you to become the last man. No, I'm just kidding. No. I think the will that wills nothing. So this willing of nothing, it's not a good thing, but at the same time, we can't get rid of our particularity. So there isn't this moment where we get to that. But this also leads to evil, right? Like evil is not some amoral action for Schelling. It's a character of our personality that is consumed by the fire of darkness. It's consumed by eroticism, right? Eros. It's assumed by, and thanatos, I guess you could say. And in a sense, it's a death in the sense of killing our true potential, right? So we're trying to make up for this lack of the ground in order to maintain, filling it. And the end of a fulfillment of desires, it's a paradox because you would never reach that moment of nirvana. It's not an emptying out like in Meister Eckhart's Gelassenheit, where you kind of release yourself. This is a point where it's a paradox where you say you're going to get here. I only want this cup of coffee, but then you want another cup, and then you want another one, and then you want another one. And so it's an endless cycle where you deteriorate as an individual. And, Schelling says being is will. Ursein ist Wollen in German. Like being is the will. Being is will. Just like in Spinoza, conatus, the striving. Schopenhauer does get a lot from Schelling. But Schopenhauer knew that we couldn't escape from this cycle, and so he also said, music and art was a great way of bringing us back to life. Which funny. Schelling says, sorry to be biblical again. He says that Judas wasn't a sinner because he sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. Judas was a sinner because he chose egoity. He chose desire. He chose to cut off a piece of him and only want this endless craving, this endless cycle of drives over and over again. And so his character, his personality, his individuality was evil, wrathful. Right. Sorry, I know that didn't answer your question.
No. I mean, I just think that it gets us back to this way that Zizek brings up the death drive, this notion of there being this movement to stop Eros in its incessant expansion and unifying and growth. So, but I do think it's interesting that there is a resonance with Freud where it does seem for Schelling that the death drive is this immanent principle where it's immanent to the organism, just to use it again in Schelling's term, to die in its own way and not by necessarily some external force, but there's this imminent death. And Simondon makes a lot out of this, where he describes this process of what he calls amortization, which is basically as the individual individuates, there are little sort of pieces of, I use the word pieces, it's not the word he uses, but there are basically little slices, little quota of quantums of death. By that he means sort of the individual can't individuate incessantly. There are these strata of stability, of order, that lose that metastable elasticity. And these little deaths kind of weave inside the individual as it individuates. And that's just, I think that's for him too, correlates with his ethical principle about not wanting to be this absolute complete individual, right? Because that itself is a kind of death by other means than this natural quote unquote process.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's so funny that Simondon brought up the 1804 philosophy and religion, because that's where Schelling kind of merges into this cosmic theogonic philosophy.
Gotcha.
And it's so funny when the absolute is trying to create, in this process, it makes a copy of itself that's not as perfect, and half the copy is separated, and that separated is prime matter. It's us in nature. But we get entangled with necessity. And so we're always in that drive. Again, there it is. There's that drive. The one thing I like about this is that it's the fall of humankind, or the fall of all life in a sense, is really mortality. It's not Adam and Eve ate some apple, we're all in sin. No, it has nothing to do with that. It's a great thing about it. The whole thing is that it's the finality of mortality. I need to bring up Sartre, but Sartre said we're condemned to be free, and that's true. We are condemned to be free, but we're also condemned to live as well. And this process of living is contradiction and strife and loving and lots of everything else. We're entangled with necessity because these principles, according to Schelling, are cosmic. They're primordial. They're in everything. So the same thing with the tree outside my window right now. There's that potential there as well too. So he's got this kind of like not very noticeable, but sort of panpsychism going on as well too, that some Whiteheadians kind of like, that there is this reason extended into nature, and there's this, I'm sorry, I'm going off on tangents.
No, I mean, you could say it's panpsychism or panentheism, right? But also, you brought up Sartre, and I do remember early on in the text, I'm not exactly sure how he phrases it, but he has a way of phrasing it that reminded me of Sartre, where he talks about, I forget how he phrases it. He talks about perhaps it's existence, perhaps it's being, but there's something that is horrible in being. I'm trying to remember. It kind of, when you brought up the tree, it reminded me, in Nausea, when the narrator is
Racontant touches the tree. It's nothing.
There's too much tree, right? It's de trop. There's something horrible about the surplus of existence. But I'm not exactly sure how Schelling phrases it. As I said, I can't look at this PDF because it's bad. Anyway,
I'm having such a good time with both of you. This is so much fun, honestly.
Awesome.
This has been the best podcast I've been on.
That's awesome. That's what we strive for. Good to know. It's a good formula.
If you want, we can start to wrap up. Perhaps you could, if I can't find this, then, we can, maybe you can tell us more about what you're working on currently, and where you see your studies continuing in the future.
Yeah. So I'll tell you something interesting. When the pandemic started, I had noticed that there were not a lot of people that wanted to talk about Schelling. And so I wanted to create some form of community or some form of access outlet so I could talk to other Schellingians, other German idealists, and talk about these things, right? And I ended up talking to, actually, believe it or not, lots of Deleuzians, lots of Whiteheadians, lots of people that wanted to talk about similar things that we're talking about right now. So I realized that the best way to do it was to popularize his philosophies. And that's what I've been doing with my Twitter account. And now with my YouTube account, I've been actually going through texts and trying to make it more accessible, because I really can't stand these YouTube videos where people are just like, I don't like scripted things. I like live discussion. It's my favorite. I like a live discussion. It's more organic. It feels like we're back in ancient Greece. The people listening are the chorus, and they're a part of it. They can write their comments and stuff. It's much better. And so I wanted to create something where there wasn't this element of just forcedness And my dissertation is literally what we're talking about. It's called Beyond the Abyss of Reason, Schelling and the Unprethinkable. I'm mapping out this process. And for me, what makes this dynamic, so I'm talking about the freedom essay, the ages of the world, and the philosophy of revelation. And I'm talking literally about the revelation of the cosmos. And I'm not making it religious. It's not. It's the revealing of this unfolding process. And so I'm talking about all these texts. And we're kind of we're moving. We're trying to philosophize that ancestral event, the beginning of all beginnings, and we're talking about this movement and this dynamism that's in all these principles and properties that are in all life. So that's what my dissertation is pretty much doing, and that's the title of it, actually. By the way,
I do like that the unprethinkable. I think that's fascinating. It makes me think again, just because it's obligatory, I suppose, makes me think back to Deleuze, that for him, which he finds somewhat in Artaud, but we could say it's perhaps in Schelling too, that there is an encounter, a violence that forces thinking, right? That there is some sort of shock that forces us to pose a problem and to think, rather than it being a sort of natural God-given thing. There is a genitality. There is a birth of thinking within thought.
Yeah,
a naturalism, I guess, too, or
absolutely.
like a naturalism, or like a thinking is not a given. I guess, say that in a different way.
I think Schelling would agree. Like, when Deleuze talks about the agitprop of third world cinema, where there's the people are missing from film, we need this shock to believe in the world again. I think it can be similar in Schelling, that Schelling thinks that even writing in this kind of theogonic way, or using kind of theodicy, using the drama of this tragedy, it brings us back to life. It brings us back to philosophy. So it is a philosophy of life and a philosophy of freedom. And what he hated about Hegel was it's so abstract.
Yeah.
You're talking about the absolute idea and the absolute concept, and you're going through all of these things, but what you're doing is you're forgetting life. This is not a concept of life. And he got in a lot of trouble for saying this. He was once arguing with a Catholic priest named Paulus. And Paulus said, no, this is the best of all possible worlds. Leibniz was right. And Schelling said, by you saying that, you yourself have destroyed God's freedom. If you say God necessarily had to create this cosmos, then you've taken away it. You need to make this contingent. So this mimics almost what Meillassoux said, like the necessity of contingency. So the whole cosmos is the necessity of contingency. So you cannot say that. Everything needs to be, we need to be in that moment of the expressible. We can't just talk about it, right? So he almost calls the cosmos an accident, in a sense, not in what we think, like the accident as in like it's just an accident. He means literally we cannot assume everything happened for a reason. It's not necessary. So he plays on this, the necessity of contingency. Sorry.
No, and the accident is what falls out. This is kind of how Zizek remains Schellingian when he talks about, if all the numbers in the sort of primordial calculations of the world evened out, then there would be no existence, right? That
exactly.
There is this, obviously that's the title of his book, this indivisible remainder, right? But your point being that it's not an accident in the sense in which it's a mistake, which maybe is a pessimistic way of looking at it. It gets to your point, your anecdote about what Schelling says to the priest. This gets back to this moment of decision, of the splitting off, that is a activity of the will and is a free choice insofar as there is this. I suppose my question would be, if we can end on this note, but this is a big question, is there in this willingness to know itself, whether it be God or the ground, I'm not exactly sure how to attribute it, is this a part of increasing potency insofar as it's kind of we don't know what a body can do taken to its nth power. We don't know what God can do taken to its nth power. It is this striving towards higher potency, or is that to attribute to God an imperfection that perhaps Schelling wouldn't necessarily like? I guess that would be the question. Is there something extant that's sort of more God in God than Well, I guess that's a theological question. Is there a way for God to increase his own power, right, in this primordial striving or moving?
No, it would be about us. It would be how we increase our own power, our
Mhm.
own personality, and our own individual freedom.
I like
And
that.
it's the force of the decision,
Hmm.
right? The tragic is an act of inhibition, the anstos. It enables us to act. As he says, contradiction enables us to act, makes us to move. It's not so much this sovereign theology that stands over us. It really is kind of like an organic process, and that we as individuals, you could still be a shitty person and desire and desire and desire, and you're still free. But that in the end will lead to your own. That's futile in a sense. But he won't say that. He wants you. And this is why he calls it die Abgrund der Freiheit, the abyss of freedom. So freedom is born out of this abyss, and it's this abyss or this tragedy is the cycle of what we human beings are a part of. So I guess you could say it is that I empowering or enacting or creating. It would be creating.
Hmm.
He would be all about creating.
I like that, and I also liked I appreciated when Zizek got a little etymological about the Anstas, right? Because
Yes.
it's both an obstacle and a stimulus, right?
Yes.
And I think that gets to the heart of one of Schelling's ways of describing contradiction is not something wherein there is, as you mentioned earlier, the sublation where there is this higher synthesis or something, but that the contradictions never resolve, right? And that's part of the struggle, but that's also part of the will to create, the will to go further, it sort of increases our power in a certain way by resisting. The same way the lifting weights, right? How else is one going to increase one's potentiality without the resistance against one's muscles or forces?
To relate it back to Deleuze, like to be one individual is to kill yourself, right? In a funny manner, to excise all of these larval cells is to destroy your true, right? That is who you are. You are what is the body without organs but this endless potentiality of virtual selves, larval selves ready to become actualized and intensive. So the minute we do that, that's it. Like that's if you become an individual, and this is why there's no subject object. It's a dissenter. This is why he loved Francis Bacon. What is Bacon? And it's funny because Bacon always put a human character in a geometrical shape. Like if you look at Vasquez's popes, he's always in a square and he's screaming, and you're supposed to look for the affect. I think the same thing can be applied. The same thing can be applied as well with Schelling, in that we're not meant to be these, square off, perfect cut individuals that get to this point of absolute knowing at the end of phenomenology of spirit. No, that's not what happens. Schelling says profoundly that even melancholia covers nature. So there is this element of strife and darkness in all life, and it's a matter of going through and kind of overcoming. Even God overcame this chaotic principle and all the or whatever creation have occurred, right? So it really is about overcoming and becoming. All I have to say is 2 words, and I went through this like tangent. I apologize.
It shows that there's obviously still more to discuss and
more ground to cover.
More ground to cover and uncover. I would say that one of the things about the ages of the world, I was reading some of the Freedom essay, and I was saying to Coop how Ages of the World feels, it's almost got an intoxicating vibe. I said it felt like Schelling was on cough syrup when he wrote it, right? Because maybe that's the mystical side, or maybe that's the fragmentary notes side, because it doesn't read like some of the other expositions that I've seen. It feels like a little bit more maybe informal is just a simple way of putting it.
It's written almost in a poetic manner. It's very poetic. It's like a cosmic poem. The Freedom essay is rigorous, and it starts off with system and world. It builds up through his law of predication, and you go through this, and then finally you find out the predicates of the ground and all of these things. So yes, it's the Freedom essay is very difficult. I find this short, 60-page text of the Ages of the World to be excellent because It's got parts of the freedom essay in it. It's got this poetic manner, but it's also got really interesting things to think about.
Yeah.
Like when you go, what? What did I just read?
Yeah. What Coop and I both appreciate is the fact that we were able to discuss with you this cosmological drama. That's something that Coop and I have been kind of interested in these past few weeks, is specifically, obviously, because we were discussing Deleuze, and Deleuze, some of the more cosmological resonances with, for example, the differential, right? And how that
Right.
just applied to thinking in cosmological terms about the differential is something that we can see mirrored in Schelling, albeit in a slightly different language, but still with a similar inspiration. And I think that that's part of what I liked about it. And I wish that would have been one of the things that Zizek actually talked about, when really he'd rather do his Lacanian shtick, which is fine, and it's good, and it has, it works for what it does. But I think that there's a little bit of Schelling that's missing in that 100-page introduction. And I kind of wish it would have been pared down to like 30 pages and cut out a lot of the rambling. No offense, Zizek. At the end, the Zizek bibliography is going to be like thousands and thousands of pages. Like, couldn't you just have been more succinct?
This is why I didn't say to read the intro. Like I said, you could.
I know.
What I find about it is that what he does is he systematizes Schelling through Hegel and Lacan. And so he reads the Hegelian dialectic through Schelling, which I think asphyxiated, that's not even a word. It completely takes out all of the free and differential aspect of the essay. And he takes out the poetic aspect, and he really doesn't like the mystical elements of it. He thinks you could just excise that, and that's not part of it. When I brought up at the beginning of this episode the Jakob Burma passage, now when you go back and reflect on our show and think about that passage will make so much more sense to both of you, and I think it's also a little more helpful as well too. But yeah, Zizek is still great. He does a really interesting job of reading Schelling. He's a Hegelian, of course, and a Lacanian. And if you really like, if you like psychoanalysis and you like some of the mystical and the cosmological aspects, I highly suggest Sean McGrath's text, The Dark Ground of Spirit, which goes through the psychoanalytic, the libidinal, the death drive, goes through all of the stuff with Jakob Burma and the mystical and the theological and this drama. And it's great. It's fantastic. And Sean's a wonderful scholar and one of my mentors. So I've only met him like twice, and I've talked to him through emails, but the way that he lectures, I've never even really been his student, but I feel like I am, because every time I hear him speak or whatever, I pick something up from him. So
if you're sort of suggesting we reach out, because I would like to go, as I mentioned, I like the notion of Schelling and Freud sharing a kind of conceptual universe. I would actually appreciate that more than Lacanian Schelling. Not that I have anything against Lacan, but I do think there's something, for me at least, with Freud that is easier to sink my teeth into. Even if he goes wrong at places, obviously nobody's perfect. We've mentioned on the show where I think Freud goes wrong, but I do think that there's a lot more clarity in Freud. And so Freud and Schelling, discussion would, for me, be more concrete than a Lacan and Schelling discussion, which we got from Zizek.
Yes. And the word in German, bewusstlos, which means the unconscious. It's unconscious. And this the unconscious that's linked to the past, right? And then how it, from the trauma of all of these, from this empty ground, and how those forces and drives get, emerged into prime matter. I'm sorry, you guys keep trying to end the show and I just keep talking.
I'm the one that kept talking, and we can sort of, obviously Coop's job is to edit, so he can edit out where he sees fit. But I do like everything that we discussed, not just, as I said, I appreciated the cosmological aspect, some of the psychoanalytic implications I know we barely touched on, but I think that, as I said, that's already in Zizek's text and didn't need to necessarily get brought to light. But you could have this cosmological interpretation, this psychoanalytic interpretation, this mystical interpretation, all of these different threads that are sort of interwoven into the same text means, I mean, as you said, I'm not sure if it's difficult necessarily, but it's dense, and it allows for multiple readings and multiple points of view that really reflects its wealth. For that, I think that I'm glad we decided to look at this for today. Reading more into Schelling gave me a deeper appreciation of Deleuze, because as you know, that's one of the things where the little gaps in one's knowledge of the history of philosophy can be a sort of hindrance to getting more out of what he's doing. And so filling in this gap, or at least a part of the gap, because obviously Schelling too has a wide corpus that even on this fucking text, as you said, there's perhaps 20 variations that we only know 3 of. Even for this one text, there's a whole, one can devote one's life to just studying that and the potential missing links. So, it's nice to be able to dive into these unknown depths with you. And I really do appreciate having you go on. And, I know that perhaps in the new year, we can have you back to talk about another thinker. And I mean, for example, we haven't done an episode on Kant. I know I would want to look at that with you. Obviously, Cooper would probably want you to look at Stirner with us, so there's all kinds of potentials for doing another episode in the near future.
Well, thank you so much. I would totally take a look at Stirner. I know he was interesting. Another marginal figure like Schelling, who's not really,
very much, yeah,
really well known, and very interesting. So I would be down to totally take a look at that for sure. Yeah, that sounds so interesting.
If you have enough background in Fichte, which I don't personally, but I think that would probably, even Schelling to some degree, because of the idea of the creative nothing that is one of Stirner's big points.
Cooper, if you want a real fast, nice, short, succinct jump into Fichte, read his lectures called The Vocation of a Scholar. Not the vocation of man, but the vocation of a scholar. It was, when he gave these speeches, and they're really, really good. It's really, really nice. And he breaks down everything, the anstos, the not I, the self-positing, all of that stuff. It's not long. It's about 60 pages, just like the Weltalter, the Ages of the World. So yeah, take a look at that. That will give you a lot of background. I mean, you could read The Science of Knowledge. It's massive. That's a great text.
That's also something that he rewrote a lot of times, right? As far as I know.
Oh my God, yeah.
I suppose that was just a thing that one did in this time and in this period. I mean, was this something that I'm trying to think? I guess that was just something one did. One just rewrote the same thing over and over. There's all kinds of thinkers I can think that kind of did stuff like this.
It's so funny. You want to hear the funniest thing about this is that Fichte met Kant. Okay, so he actually went all the way to Königsberg and met Kant, and Kant loved him. And he said, "Can I get a loan from you?" And Kant's like, "No, I'm not going to give you money. I don't even know you." But so what happened was he helped Fichte get a publication. When it got published, everyone thought it was Kant. So Fichte got really, really popular. And by 1799, I'll show you next time I talk to you, letters Kant would write to his friends about how terrible Fichte was. This guy's making my philosophy into a shit show. Like, what's going on here?
Wow.
Couldn't stand it. It's so funny. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, that is interesting. I mean, that's just funny that Kant, I can't imagine him talking shit, but apparently we're all human. I always think of Kant as like a machine, a sort of celibate machine, just
not in his teenage years.
So he had some debauchery. That's good. All right, good to know. That actually changes my image of the man, because I think of him as like the virgin philosopher, but apparently not. So
he was at a dinner party and someone broke a glass. He got up, picked the pieces, went outside, and disappeared for 2 hours. Finally, his friend came out and said, "What are you doing?" He's like, "I've just measured the geological structure of erosion. So if I've dig 9 feet, the glass won't come up. In 100 years, someone won't step on it." And he did that. For 2 hours, he did that. He dug the 9 feet and put it, buried everything. What?
I mean,
insane.
That's not how I would choose to spend my time at a party, but that's a good one. These kind of little biographical tidbits are always interesting. It's good to think about these things as well as the big lofty ideas to sort of reincarnate or to give flesh back to the thinker. It's always good to remind ourselves that these people were flesh and blood. They had strange desires and perversions and idiosyncrasies, right? It's good to remind ourselves, instead of just thinking of them as in terms of their ideas, to give a little bit of life back to the individual.
That's awesome.
Christopher, thanks for joining us today on the Machine of Unconscious Happy Hour. It's been great. And I do look forward to you sharing some of this stuff on Twitter. We'll let you enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And this was so much fun, honestly. And I hope I answered all your questions and I didn't go too off on tangent.
We like the tangents on this show. And
Yeah,
it
for
always,
sure.
all roads lead back to the general gist. And I do think that even if the one question about the death drive didn't get answered directly, I think we talked a lot about, we kind of circled, not to use your image, we kind of circled around it and we got to it. And I think that, for me, and this is just funny, you can look at Zizek, Lacan, Freud, Deleuze, and then 100 other thinkers, and almost every time they have their own unique addition and spin to the death drive, because Freud himself even oscillated between several kind of ways of formulating it, even if at his worst he thinks of it as aggressivity and sort of destructive drive, right, or thanatos. And so I think his initial muddying of the waters for that concept leads everyone to propose a new version of it. So whenever the death drive is talked about, it is kind of like Body Without Organs or something like this, right? It spawns discussion and there's no, I don't even call like disagreements or like someone thinks like, oh no, this is maybe Lacan does, but I think that everyone has their own little spin on it. And so to be able to like talk about it, everyone's like wrong and right at the same time. That's part of the fun of that concept. That is just an example of a fruitful concept that may be empty in content, but can then assume any particular content. And it leads to a discussion, which I think is perhaps more useful than it standing for any one thing.
Well, thank you so much.
We'll be talking to you soon. And we're going to finish up here just with going over what we're doing next. But our episode today will, without any unforeseen catastrophes, will drop in 2 weeks. And we'll obviously be talking before then, so we'll let you go. And thanks again for joining us.
No problem.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.